The subject tonight is the value of freedom. Why is freedom valuable? And I think it is valuable. I think that's a starting point. By freedom here, I mean certainly political freedom and freedom from circumstances that make it impossible for me to do the things that I want to do. So it could be an avalanche, it could be a disease, things that get in my way. Now, the question I want to raise is a fairly narrow question. We do distinguish between intrinsic value and extrinsic, or value of a means rather than the value of an end. And what I want to ask is what kind of value freedom has. And since, as I will describe to you, some things in the world, in our lives, have intrinsic value, some have extrinsic value, and some have both. So there are a possibility of three answers. Either freedom has only intrinsic value, or only extrinsic value, or both. So I want to answer that question, and then I want to describe why it matters, what difference it makes. So let's start from the beginning. Intrinsic value means that something is valued for itself, not for its future consequences, not for things that it can do for you, but for itself. And I'm talking now psychologically rather than philosophically. I'm not talking about what should be intrinsic or what should be only intrinsic. People value things, they value things in various ways. For example, there are rectangular greenish pieces of paper, which especially in the United States, people think a lot of. $100 bills. You know, I held up my hand with $300 bills. I have a lot of customers. Why do they want those rectangular pieces of paper? They could take a pad of paper and cut it up into rectangular shape themselves. But this is money. Okay. Why do they want money? Because money buys things. Money can get them things that they want. That's extrinsic value. You want the rectangular pieces of paper because with them you can get other things that you want. If suddenly the United States changed its currency, those very same rectangular pieces of paper would be worthless. If the United States decided to go back to a barter system and not use cash, they would be worthless because their only value is as a means to get something else. That's called extrinsic value. Then there are things which people want in and of themselves, that is to say, not for the sake of getting something else with them. So imagine the person's last 10 minutes and you offer him X, $100 million. It's worthless because in 10 minutes there's nothing you can do with it. All the money in the world, there's nothing you can do with it in 10 minutes. But there are things which a person could say, reasonably say, that he wants in the last 10 minutes, pleasure. The pleasure is what it is. It makes an experience more worthwhile, certainly for many people. Or fulfilling an obligation. If you know that you're going to die in 10 minutes, and you realize that you didn't pay somebody a debt, you'd be very interested in giving instructions that the debt should be paid. Maybe only you know about it. And if you don't give the instructions, the person will never get his money back. I say, okay, that's worthwhile doing. You might ask 10 minutes. I don't want him to suffer. He lent me money. I want him to have his money. So that's intrinsic value. My example of something that has both intrinsic and extrinsic value is listening to a symphony when you are taking a course, university course in the symphony, and you're going to be tested on that symphony next week. It may be a beautiful symphony, Mozart's Jupiter Symphony. So you enjoy listening to the symphony, and also you're increasing your acquaintance with the symphony so that next week you'll do a better job on the exam. So it has both intrinsic and extrinsic value. Don't confuse intrinsic value with being really valuable. That's really important. It's intrinsically valuable. And extrinsically valuable meaning, well, it doesn't really matter. It's only a means, it's not the end. That's not correct. There can be very large and very small extrinsic values, and there can be very large and very small intrinsic values. So the fact that it's intrinsic doesn't make it really important, and the fact that it's extrinsic make it trivial. I'll give you an example. Oxygen to breathe. Surely the value of oxygen to breathe is only extrinsic. You don't live to breathe. You breathe to live, right? But it's very important because without the oxygen, you'll be dead. As one of the English queens was rumored to have said on her deathbed, "My kingdom," for another 5 minutes. Because she dies 5 minutes earlier, her kingdom isn't going to help her. Not going to do anything for her. So, extrinsic values can be very, very important. And if I give you a $1 bill, it's extrinsic, but it's trivial. Oxygen is very important. Pleasure, if you want the pleasure for itself, you don't want it for something else. You could want it for something else, but if you don't, that means you value it intrinsically. But it could be a trivial pleasure, a gumdrop. In the last 30 seconds, it's gone. Or it could be a spectacularly pleasant, a summer of helicopter vacationing, all over the world. Or fulfilling a moral obligation, as we said before. So there are large and small values of both types. That's not the issue. What the issue is, I'll come back to after we hopefully agree on what the answer is to the question. So what kind of value does freedom have? I want to support the position that freedom has only extrinsic value. Freedom is not valuable for itself, in and of itself, by itself. Freedom is not an end. Freedom is a means, and only a means. I want to give you an example of what this is saying. I'm not claiming this proves it. I just want you to get the intuition across to you. Proving it requires a little bit more work than just giving this one example. But let's imagine a person who's been locked up on a false charge. He's been in jail for 13 years. And he has a committee of people who are working on securing his freedom, either legally or illegally, because they know he's wrong there. He's in it by mistake. And they have a plan, and they work it through, and finally they get to the jail cell and say, "We put all the guards to sleep, and we have the keys, and in 1 minute you'll be free." He says, "Thanks for nothing." "Thanks for nothing?" "Yeah, because I'm going to die in 10 minutes. I'm going to die in 10 minutes. What can I do with the freedom?" It seems a little pale to say, "But you'll be free. You'll be free. For the last 10 minutes, you'll be free." Yeah, but there's nothing I can do with it. I can't even, go for a walk in the garden. There's nothing I can do with it. That would be an illustration of what it would mean to have pure freedom. If you tell him his last 10 minutes could be more pleasant, be more pleasure, that's not worth nothing. That's worth something. Or to fulfill an obligation. Or to do something or get something, or be something that he values internally, values for itself. It seems with freedom that wouldn't make sense. I'll give you another example. I don't know what the present law is, but about 70 years ago, the United States had a law forbidding American citizens to go to Cuba. Now, when it was passed, and when it was in existence, there were people who were worried about that. The United States government is taking away my freedom. Somehow, I couldn't get into sympathy with the problem. I never wanted to go to Cuba. I never will want to go to Cuba. Going to Cuba is absolutely off my list. So they they made a law against it. So what? It would be like for most people, if the government made a law that you can't eat sand. Would you demonstrate against that law? Would you write to your congressman and try to get it overturned? I don't think he would mind. So I can't eat sand. I wasn't going to eat sand anyhow. So freedom seems to be a matter of what you can do with it. The value of the freedom is the value of what you can do with it, which would mean that its value is only extrinsic. That's what it would mean. But all I've given you now is a couple of examples. I haven't given you a general reason to think it's always true. Maybe there are other cases where it does have intrinsic value. So I want to suggest a way of looking at the problem, which I think helps to solve it. When you say that something has intrinsic value, anything, it should mean, if I imagine the world, a certain scenario, let's call this thing Q. I imagine the world, and in the circumstances of the world at that time, Q is there. Q is found there. If Q has intrinsic value, should be that if I subtract Q from the circumstances, the world becomes a somewhat worse place. Now, of course, you have to be very careful just to subtract Q and nothing else. So nothing else of value. How many values does oxygen have? So and so much. Well, let's see. If I just subtract all the oxygen, how bad would the world be? Terrible, because everyone would die. That's why. So that's not just taking the oxygen out. You've got to describe a situation in which you could take Q out and leave everything else the same, and see whether that makes a difference to the overall circumstances. By taking it out, their value should go down. By adding it when it isn't there, the value should go up. If that doesn't happen, that's a good sign that Q doesn't have intrinsic value. So I suggest we try that experiment with freedom. Now, to do this experiment, I have to describe to you certain circumstances. I mean this to work generally, but to make the argument, take particular circumstances and imagine putting Q in and taking Q out and seeing whether the whole becomes better or worse. Now, when I do this, when I describe it to you, I'm asking you to think about the description and see how it seems to you, whether it gets worse or not. If someone says he has his impression is different from mine, I have nothing to say to him. My argument works for a person who has the same impression that I have. Now, I think that, in my experience, the vast majority of people share the same impression that I have. So here's the example that's supposed to give us this general perspective. I want you to meet my friend Fred the hobo. Fred lives at the city dump, and American city dump. So there's last year's clothes styles and discarded clothes, and there's food from restaurants and weddings, which is a day old or 2 days old. Not the best, but an American city dump is better than the whole of Bangladesh or Argentina, now that's been decades communist. So if I would ask Fred, how are you, Fred? How's your life? Do you have a good life? Fred would say, not really. Well, Fred, do you have a bad life? And Fred would say, not really. I have enough to eat. Okay, it's 24 to 48 hours old. Still food, still nutritious. I have clothes. Now some of them have weared, they're worn threadbare and have holes in them, but they keep you warm. So how's your overall life, George, Fred? And he says, it's sort of blah. Just is what it is. Do you wish you were somewhere else or wish you were somebody else? Not really. This is my life. take it or leave it, I'll take it. So he stays in the city dump. If he gets bored, he hops on a passing freight train and travels free of charge to the next city dump. That's Fred's life. He has no friends. Nobody knows who he is. That's his life. But he's free. He's free. He makes his own decisions. Now, 2 kidnappers have been observing George, and they have a theory that he is really a multi-billionaire in disguise. He's not indigent as he appears to be. And he has friends. So they figure out, if we kidnap Fred and hold him for ransom, we can make a lot of money. So they tie him up, and they take him off to a hut in the forest, and they're sending out signals and messages and fingerprints, and we have Fred. And if you put $2 billion into this and this bank account, let him go free. Otherwise, we're going to kill him. That's what they say. Fred's locked up in this hut in the forest. They feed him. They feed him the food that they ate 24 to 48 hours ago, the leftovers. They feed him. And when it gets cold, they give him something to wear. I mean, if he dies, they've lost their collateral. They've lost their prize, which they want money. They give him a coat, last year's style. Not a fresh coat, but enough to keep him warm. We interview Fred in the hut in the forest. How you doing, Fred? Are you happy? Not particularly. Are you unhappy? Not particularly. How's your life, Fred? Sort of blah. I get fed. And when it's cold, I have a jacket to wear. Do you miss the dump, Fred? Do you miss it? Do you wish that you could go back? Are you praying for the day when you'll be free to go back to the dump? Fred says, not really. My life is okay at the dump. My life is okay here. Not great, not terrible, just okay. Okay, now, there's a committee. Freedom for Fred. Collecting money, GoFundMe. And the kidnappers, realizing that there aren't as many resources as they thought, have lowered the price to $10,000. And they're now at $9,985. They meet you on the street, you say, $15 for Fred's freedom. Freedom. Just give us $15 and Fred will be free. Are you inclined to give them the $15? Let's make it concrete. A 6-year-old in your vicinity has just fallen off his bike, skinned his knee, and he's crying. And there's a $15 gift that would make him happy. Forget his pain. And you have a choice. You can give the $15 to the 6-year-old, or you can give the $15 to the Free Fred Fund. Which way would you give it? And why? I don't know about you, but I would give it to the 6-year-old. Because freedom for Fred has no value. It doesn't get him anything that's worthwhile. It doesn't get him anything that he values. He's just as happy in the hut as he was in the dump. He spends the rest of his life in the hut. He'll be just as happy as he was in the dump. I think under these conditions, when we look at that scenario and think, so you put freedom in, you take freedom out. At the dump, he was free. At the hut, he's not free. So that's the difference between them. If that's the only difference between them, then his freedom from the hut so he can go back to the dump, where now he's locked up, that freedom isn't worth anything. And the reason it isn't worth anything, because it doesn't produce anything of value. Now, I'm prepared to discuss this. Let me just make a prediction. because this usually happens, almost always. Someone says, but look, if he's free at the dump, there are all sorts of opportunities that could arise, all sorts of alternatives that he could choose. And in the hut, he doesn't have those alternatives. He doesn't have those opportunities. I'm telling you now, that remark proves I'm right. That remark proves I'm right. It's not an attack on me, it's support. Because what is the critic doing? The critic is introducing what he could do with his freedom at the dump, as opposed to what he can do with his freedom in the hut. That's my point. My point is, freedom is only valuable because of what you can do with the freedom. I created a situation in which the freedom at the dump and the freedom in the hut don't have any difference in what they do for him. The critic makes the mistake of changing my example into an example where there are things that the freedom in the dump can do for him. First of all, that doesn't disqualify my example, just change the example. But if he changes it into an example where there are alternatives and opportunities available to him at the dump that aren't in the hut, you say, see, freedom is valuable because if you free him from the hut, he'll have all these opportunities. Since the added value of the freedom in the dump is the value of what he can do with the freedom, that supports my proposition that freedom is only valued because of what you can do with it. The whole point of the example was to show that freedom, if you just slice off what you can do with it, there's no value left. If you have to challenge me by creating things you can do with it, you're not challenging my proposition. My proposition is that's the only way freedom gets value. Freedom gets value by what you can do with it. So by creating alternatives and possibilities and opportunities, you're confirming my point that that's how freedom gets value. Yeah, now you can struggle away. Yeah.
So I think I saw this from last time, and I think I see it this time, that yes, freedom on its own doesn't seem to be generating anything here for him. But what I think is the difference between freedom as an external means and, say, the music example you gave, is that with the music, I could sub out a different subject into that area. So for instance, your goal is you want to do well in school. So I could just change the subject from music to mathematics, and there's just nothing binding the external goal to music. So you could just acquire a different thing to get that external goal. What I think might be happening with freedom is that if you tried to substitute something else for free will to fulfill the role of the external good that it's trying to create or produce or enable, you would get a diminished result.
I don't know. I'm not following the general terms here, but let me just say the way you put it would be, if I put it that way, it would be prejudicial. You describe me as arguing that freedom doesn't generate anything for him.
In of itself.
But that's not what generate means. Generate means create something else. And that's not what I was arguing. What I'm trying to argue is that if you leave off the generating, subtract the generating, slice off the generating, then there's no value left. I'm not claiming it's not generating. I'm saying I created the circumstance in which it shouldn't generate. That's what I want. I want a situation in which it doesn't generate, and I want to say about the situation in which it doesn't generate anything, is there any value left? Mm-hmm. So I'm creating a situation so that it shouldn't generate. That's the purpose of my example. That's why what I say when you look at him and you ask Fred in the hut and Fred at the dump, and you ask him what do you prefer, and what are you missing, and what do you want, and so on and so on, and you get the answer from him. It's all the same to me. There are two things I want from your picturing that scenario. One is, okay, so it's not generating anything for him. That's the way I've created it, so it doesn't generate anything for him. And then to say, well, look at it. It just doesn't make any difference. There's no reason to spend $15 to get that freedom because it isn't really better for him. his life really isn't better under those circumstances. Yeah.
I believe there is a circumstance where freedom does provide a positive, it is in and of itself a positive end. During the COVID lockdown, there were people that I know who, before lockdown and after lockdown, and during lockdown, their behavior didn't change much. In general, they were involved in their little personal matters that were entirely online on the computer in their house, went for a walk every now and then, and cooked at home. They could still do all that during the pretty intense lockdown period, and they continued to do that. The only difference was their mental state during the lockdowns was such that the feelings of restriction negatively affected them, and as soon as the lockdown ended, they felt more happier for whatever reason, and that would be the freedom, I'm assuming, that is not being in lockdown. Yet their actions and their value from that lockdown wouldn't change at all. And so I think there is a certain effect that freedom has on people, just to that can be motivating and uplifting.
Okay, now let me.
That in and of itself is valuable.
Well, is it the freedom that's intrinsically valuable, or is it the motivating and uplifting that's intrinsically valuable? It sounds to me, the way you've described it, that the freedom has an effect on them, it uplifts them, and it motivates them. And it sounds to me like it's the motivation and uplifting that's valuable. And the freedom is valuable because it gets you the motivating and uplifting, which would mean, the way you're describing it, the freedom isn't intrinsically valuable. It's not valuable for itself. It's valuable because it gives them motivation and uplifting. That's what I would call an extrinsic value. So be careful. It's sort of like music. Let's take really boring, dull, poor quality music. But if you're exercising and it has a beat, it can give you more strength, more energy, and more endurance. So you say, well, the music is very valuable then because you have more strength and endurance. It's valuable because it gives you a better ability to exercise. That's not the value of the music intrinsically. It's the music is a means by which you get more strength and endurance. So it's valuable, it's definitely valuable, but it's valuable like money is valuable. It's valuable because it gets you something else that you want. That's called extrinsic. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah.
So if I'm understanding, the Rabbi is proposing that the reason that gives value to freedom is what you can achieve with it. So, for instance, if a person could achieve, is freedom, the value of freedom, is it that that's the only way through which you can actually achieve those things, or we could propose that there's other ways through which we could achieve those things? For instance, like, okay, if it's only that, but if it's freedom the only way to achieve those things, what's the question of the value over there? If freedom is the only way.
Okay. The first question has an easy answer, and the second question I think now is turned around. No, to have value, extrinsic value, does not mean that this is the only way to get what you want. Does not mean that. There can be 17 ways to get what you want. Each one of them has extrinsic value of being a way to get what you want. Mm-hmm. So, how am I going to get the car? Well, I could get money and buy the car. I could ask somebody to give it to me as a gift. Mm-hmm. I could inherit the car. I could get the car in many different ways. So it doesn't have to be the only way to get it. It has value even if it's only one of many ways to get it. Yeah. Are we finished?
Yeah, but like, let's say for instance, like
I mean, even if, but let me ask you this, the way you put it. So, but imagine the case where it's the only way to get it. I don't think that makes any difference at all. You seem to feel that would somehow change the picture.
No, it's just the question. The question
no, then it doesn't have to be. No, doesn't. Yeah.
In the example Rabbi's getting with Fred and the dump, if we're saying freedom's value is only what you can do with that freedom, right? But then if we're giving an example where we remove, if we're saying this is a scenario where freedom comes along with absolutely none of its potential, of the things that it potentially allows, haven't you just removed the freedom? If you're telling me going back to the dump includes no opportunities from getting free from the kidnappers and going back to the dump includes no opportunities, will give him no joy of none of the just pure joy of just knowing that I am free, I am not stuck, will give him none of the things that can come out of freedom. Well then, haven't you removed that from being a scenario where there isn't even any freedom? If you're telling, right?
Well, I don't think that's what I'm describing.
Necessarily?
I'm not a question necessarily. It's not what I'm describing at all. At the dump is a much wider selection of what to eat, what to wear, and he has the option to go to another city. Locked up in the hut, he can't do any of those things. Objectively speaking, he has much less freedom in the hut than he does at the dump. The question is whether that freedom does anything for him, whether it produces anything else of value. The point of my example, by the way, you put my position slightly different from the way I mean it. I'm not, how should I say? I'm not assuming that freedom only has extrinsic value. I'm trying to prove that. I'm not assuming that.
Right.
So I'm taking a situation, I'm just describing the situation. I want a person to look at the situation and see how you judge it, how do you interpret it, and what relevance it has to value. So I've chosen a situation where objectively, the freedom we're talking about is particularly the freedom of not being in the hut, not being locked up in the hut. He definitely is more free at the dump than he is at the hut. That's objectively true. Now the question is whether that freedom is worth anything. I've created a situation where the freedom doesn't generate anything else of value, so I've removed all of its extrinsic value, and now I want you to just think about it and think whether, but still, even so, it's better that he should be at the dump. It's better that he should be free. Even though it doesn't bring him anything else that's valuable, just being free at the dump is better than being in the hut. I think that sounds peculiar. Yeah?
But didn't we say there is things that he's getting at the dump? He could go
Listen
to
again.
places,
Listen again.
or he could have
No, you're
that I am free.
No, listen again. You're confusing having alternatives on the one hand with those alternatives creating more value on the other hand. A person can, take for example the law against going to Cuba. I lost the freedom to go to Cuba. Why don't I care about it? Because I don't want to go to Cuba. The freedom to go to Cuba means nothing to me because I don't want to use it. I'm not interested in it. That being the case, giving it to me or taking it away from me makes no difference to my life at all. Is there an objectively increase in my freedom if they cancel the law? Sure, now I can go to Cuba. Before I couldn't go to Cuba. But my ability to go to Cuba means nothing to me because it doesn't do anything for me. If freedom were intrinsically valuable, I should say, wow, I have a better life. Now the doors to Cuba are open. I don't feel that my life is any better when they open the doors to Cuba. One second.
So any given freedom is only as valuable as you perceive it to be, basically.
No, I'm not talking about perception now. The words didn't come up in the whole discussion. I'm talking about subjectivity versus objectivity. I'm talking about where the value of freedom comes from. What makes it valuable? We're starting all with the agreement that it is valuable. I want to know what kind of value it has. My claim is the value of freedom is like the value of $100 bills. $100 bills are valuable, really valuable, because of the things they can buy. Their only value is you can buy things with them. If suddenly no one would sell you anything for $100 bills, you wouldn't collect them. What would you do with them? Put them on the wall? Right? They're valuable because they get you other things that you want. So my point is, if you consider situations in which freedom doesn't get you anything you want, then the freedom itself isn't valuable. That's my proposition that I'm trying to support. I'm trying to show you an example where when you look at it, you say, well, golly, at the dump he can do all sorts of things that he can't do in the hut. But if you ask him, do you prefer being at the dump with all those alternatives versus being in the hut without them? He says, no, I'm happy here. I'm going to stay here forever. I don't need to go back to the dump. And if they take me back to the dump, I won't be unhappy either. I'll be happy at the dump also. Or blah. I'll be blah in both places. Under those conditions, freeing him from the hut so he can get to the dump has no value. That's the intuition I want you to share. I want you to that to be kind of obvious to you. Okay, under these conditions, no point in investing in his freedom because it has no value, because he can't do anything with it that's of value to him. And that the conclusion is, freedom is only valuable because of what you can do with it, not because of what it is itself.
And how is this? So is that not saying that in a sentence, freedom's value is subjective?
Not at all. Well, okay. The truth is, the word subjective has two different meanings, and they're often confused. Sometimes when people say subjective, what they mean is it's not really true. It's not objective. Anybody can say whatever he wants. There's no standards for getting it right or wrong. That's what they mean by subjective, as opposed to objective. Sometimes subjective means it's a quality of experience, and the value is because of what it constitutes for experience. Subjective means a subject who experiences the world. It's nothing to do with being right or wrong or true or false. In fact, this type of area of subjectivity is objectively correct. There's a right and wrong. For example, you can lie about having a pain. The pain is subjective. The pain is an experience of a subject. But there's an objective truth about whether you have pain or not. That's real truth. You can't make up anything you like, and you're not right just because you say so. So if you meant that it's subjective in the sense that it's determined by experience, that's correct, because I'm talking about valuing. I'm talking about the psychology of value, not the philosophy of value. I'm not telling people what they ought to value and what ought to be intrinsic and what ought to be extrinsic. I'm talking about how people value things in the world. That's subjective, yes.
To their own feelings about it.
Yeah, but when you say those words, the next words come up. So nothing's right and wrong, nothing's true and false, nobody can tell you what to think. All that is not what we're talking about. We're talking about it's what a person subjectively experiences in the world, about which there are truths and theories and explanations and falsehoods and lies. It's all, in terms of truth, it's all absolutely objective. It's just that it's objective truth about your experience, rather than objective truth about sugar dissolving in tea, or the revolution of Pluto, right? It's a question of what the subject matter is, not the standards by which you interpret and evaluate it. Unfortunately, in English, the word subjective is used both ways, and so people float back and forth from one to the other. That's why I like to avoid the word, but if you do use the word, you got to know what it has to mean in this context. Yeah.
Could you give me an example of something that has intrinsic value? I might not
Yeah.
understand.
So I gave two. Let's go back over them. Let's take, now, I remember, it has the value for some people sometimes. We're talking about people now, right? Pleasure. Just having a pleasure. Now,
Why is that intrinsic?
and again, I'm not talking about it being. I'm talking about a person valuing it that way. You ask him, why are you eating ice cream? Because I like it. Why are you doing something that you like? Why am I doing something I like? Hello, do you live on this planet? Why? Because I like it. That's why I'm doing it. That could be his answer. His answer could be, I'm doing this now because it gives me pleasure, and I want pleasure now. End of story. It's not because it lowers my blood pressure. It's not because I need to gain weight for a weight exam. It's not because I'm using up the ice cream in the house so nobody else can have it. Those things could be true. They could be true also. But also it could be true that I'm eating the ice cream because I enjoy the pleasure and I want the pleasure. I don't want it for something else. That's an example of an intrinsic value. I'm valuing this experience of eating ice cream intrinsically for itself. If you asked me, my last 60 seconds, would you like some ice cream? I could say yes, because I'll enjoy it. If you asked me my last 60 seconds, would you like $14,000? I say no, because in 60 seconds, there's nothing I can do with $14,000. Because dollars are only good for buying other things with.
I understand that. I was wondering if someone lives their life, living, doing everything l'shem shamayim, a lot of things lose their intrinsic value because they're just an aid. Even something that gives you pleasure, you only use that pleasure to assist in your service to Hashem. The example of someone, some people make a bracha to eat, some people eat to make a bracha.
I think that's very true. What you're saying now is very true, and it's quite deep. It's very important. In the book that I'm writing now, I have a whole section on that idea. That once you're doing things l'shem shamayim, the things that you used to believe were intrinsically valuable lose their intrinsic value. That's exactly correct. That's exactly correct. That's the logic of the situation. And if you're spiritually alive, spiritually integrated, holy, you'll shift from seeing it as intrinsically valuable to seeing it as something which is only extrinsically valuable. I think that's exactly right.
Is there a certain level of, I guess, hedonism that one could live that freedom would, the closer you get to that, the more intrinsically valuable freedom is? Is that something that...
Well, that will depend upon circumstances. Could be that with freedom you could achieve more and more pleasure. Could be that not. What was the book? What was it called? Fear of Freedom or Flight from Freedom? Where
Free from freedom?
No, that's too cute. The idea was that for some people, freedom is a terrible burden. It puts terrible strain on them.
Burden of choice.
I'll give you an example of this, an extreme example. There are people who are in prison. They serve their prison sentences, and they are freed. And the first thing they do is commit a crime so as to go back to prison. They'd rather be in prison. They don't want to be out of prison. They don't want to face choices. They don't want to take responsibility for decisions. They don't want to put themselves at risk. They know prison life. They've reconciled themselves to it, and they'd rather be in prison. So not always does increased freedom bring increased pleasure. So it would depend for a hedonist whether the freedom that he would have would actually give him more pleasure. It's not obvious.
So, imagining a situation is, as you said, where you have Q in the world, you take out Q, nothing changes. Let's say then you added H.
Nothing changes. Nothing of value changes.
Nothing value. So let's say the pleasure doesn't go up or down, just various things that you would regard as intrinsically valuable. Currently, they don't go up and down. Then suddenly you add H, and you see a lot of different things with intrinsic value, pleasure, maybe a sense of meaning. All these things suddenly spike up. And then if you removed Q, you would see all the benefit that came up when H was brought into the equation lost. And so that's the idea that these two are working in composite potentially. Now,
yeah,
and
but
then I'll say the case that I'm imagining specifically.
But what you're describing is not a situation of testing whether it has intrinsic value. The point of my scenario is to test whether it has intrinsic value.
I agree with.
So you're describing a situation where it will have extrinsic value.
No, what I'm saying, because
Sounds like it.
I'm saying is, it has something of a non-replaceable extrinsic value. So
extrinsic or intrinsic?
Extrinsic. So you're generating an extrinsic value, but you can't sub out. So if you were to evaluate for the test, you're trying to get a good grade, you could sub out the subject. So you can get there by studying music, but you get there by studying math. Whatever goods that free will enhances, if you took free will out, whatever substitute you brought could not produce an equal or greater result, or you would get a contradiction.
I don't think we're on the same page. First of all, I didn't mention free will. I didn't use the term the whole evening. I'm not talking about free will. I'm talking about freedom. I talk about political freedom or physical freedom, number one. But number two, if in the end, last step in your scenario, when you take Q out, all these things lose their value, that means Q has the extrinsic effect of giving value to all those things. That's extrinsic value. Point of my scenario is to test whether something has intrinsic value.
Yes.
You seem to be thinking that if something is an extrinsic value, is indispensable, can't be replaced, that makes it intrinsic. It doesn't make it intrinsic at all. The value is still what it does for something else.
But it makes it somewhere in between. When
No, it's
test the
extrinsic.
music.
It's completely extrinsic. The value of A is that A enables B. I don't care whether it's necessary or it's not necessary, replaceable or not replaceable. When you define the value is then A of itself. It's because A does this for B. If I subtract B, A doesn't have the value anymore. That's extrinsic. That's not intrinsic.
Well, I care about it, and I'm using this question as a way to figure that out, and I'm sorry for that.
Okay. Yeah.
If we see it from the side of the achievements, and let's say certain achievements get like a special status, like some rich future, if they are achieved through freedom. Let's say, for instance, there could be a way that without freedom you could achieve them, but if this achievement has a special future, if it's reached through freedom, is there it's still somehow.
Okay, I hear that, but that's just a special kind of extrinsic value that freedom has. Freedom makes possible a real achievement that's yours, achievement that you deserve credit for, and something which if it happened either because you're given a drug or someone put a gun to your head and made you do it, it wouldn't have that value. Then that's another type of extrinsic value. It's not being free, it's doing things freely that gets you the value. So it's not just being free, it's using the freedom to do certain things, and then the freedom confers on those things that you do certain status that they wouldn't otherwise have. That's extrinsic. That's not intrinsic. That's why the examples that I gave, like the guy who's in jail, and they open the door, and he says, but I'm going to be dead in 10 minutes. He's free, but he can't do anything with it. So if he can't do anything with it, it doesn't have any value. That's the position that I'm taking. Yeah.
So according to this idea that freedom is only as valuable as the opportunities it extrinsically gives to the person, and however valuable those opportunities are in that person's eyes, that's how valuable freedom would be to him.
That's very well put. That's the right way to put it, yes.
Right. So viewing freedom like that. But again, since we view, going back to the dump example, or any example, since we view that objectively the freedom still does exist, that even if you don't value that, objectively, if we see value in that, then it might, if we see value in being able to go to different cities, if we see value in different opportunities that you could achieve, but again, if you're like Fred, but you don't care about those things. So to you, the freedom is invaluable. But if we objectively see the value in that freedom, so wouldn't it be like saying that then, well, if somebody's very sick but he's very sad, right now he's suicidal, he doesn't like life. Should we not? We could heal him. Should we not heal him because right now he gives no value to life, or because we objectively know that there is value to life, and maybe he will just eventually see that? Maybe we should still value his life because objectively we know it's valuable.
Well, first of all, you started off by talking about our perspective versus his perspective. Then you saw that wasn't going to work. So then you change it into, and he'll join our perspective also in the end. Because you realize we're talking about what you called before subjective. We're talking about the quality of his experience. But what you said is exactly what I predicted. You said, we see opportunities that the freedom has that he doesn't see, or maybe he sees them and doesn't value them, he could come to value the opportunities. All of that is extrinsic value. Freedom, creating opportunities, means that with freedom you can get the opportunities. That's like with dollar bills, you can get a VCR, right? So that means you're just creating extrinsic values where I tried to create a scenario without them. But the proposition we're testing, my proposition is, all the value of freedom is extrinsic. You're not arguing against my proposition. You're arguing for my proposition. You're giving it value by giving it more extrinsic connections. Good. But the point of my whole argument was to show that the only value freedom has is extrinsic, and you're confirming that.
Right.
Well, that's fine. I'm glad to have you on my side.
Right. I'm simply arguing though that then maybe the conclusion that we shouldn't give Fred the $15 is an error, because then by that same conclusion, don't heal the suicidal man. Don't give $1 million to a baby. But you can't appreciate it now.
But that's irrelevant. It's irrelevant because I'm saying that when there's no extrinsic value, you shouldn't give him the $15. And you say sometimes there is extrinsic value, so maybe you should give him the money because of the extra. That's arguing on my side. I'm trying to give an example where there's no extrinsic value to say when there's no extrinsic value, don't give him the money. And you say, well, maybe there is extrinsic value. But you're concluding, like I said, when there isn't any, then you don't give it to him. That's what I want. My conclusion is, when there isn't any, you don't give. You can't argue against that by saying sometimes there is, so you should give. That confirms my conclusion that when you can't say that sometimes there is, then there's no point in doing it. Yeah.
Would it be correct then to say freedom is intrinsically valuable, that coercing someone would be intrinsically negative? And and therefore would actually be justifying slavery in certain circumstances.
No, certainly not. Certainly not. If freedom isn't intrinsically valuable, coercing someone is bad only if he was going to use his freedom to do something good.
So therefore,
But so one second, stop and think. If he was going to use his freedom to do something bad, then coercing him may be good, like putting a criminal in jail to prevent him from hurting other people. It can't be intrinsically bad. Why should it be intrinsically bad?
I'm saying it isn't.
It isn't. It certainly isn't intrinsically bad. It all depends on what the person was going to do with his freedom. In the case of Fred, I think it's not bad at all. It doesn't hurt him. It doesn't hurt him in any way. It doesn't deprive him of anything valuable in any way, so it's not hurting him. Yeah.
So if, again, looking at it from the achievement side, if freedom does provide an achievement of an added value, what's the way to understand that freedom has that capability of giving a special value to achievements? What that quality couldn't be somehow some special that's like to add value to achieve something.
I don't see why that isn't obviously extrinsic. Let's suppose that a school has a rule that a person of a certain type can't attend. Not allowed to attend. He can't go to school. He can't get an education. I can change him so he looks different. I can change him so he doesn't look like the ones who are kept out. He looks like one that can go in. So he now has the freedom to go in because I changed him. Why is that good for him? Because he'll get an education. Not because he can go in. It's not his being able to go in that's good. It's that because he's able to go in, he'll go in, and then he'll get an education and his life will be better. So the freedom gets him a better life. That's extrinsic. That's not intrinsic to the freedom. In order to test whether freedom has intrinsic value, what you would have to do is create a case where it doesn't do anything for you. And then see whether it's still good. The minute you add something it does for you, what you're talking about is extrinsic value, not intrinsic value. Yeah.
The worry, and Shia might have been hinting at this, maybe you accidentally built into your case a kind of deafness or insensitivity to the intrinsic value of freedom into Fred when you constructed the case. And so when we feel our freedom, we discover an intrinsic value there. We have a sense of it, whatever that is. But when Fred contemplates his intrinsic value and his choices, you built in that he feels nothing.
That's a fair comment, and I said that myself at the beginning.
Sorry.
I said it's all right. I said it at the beginning. I said this argument only works for someone who looks at the scenario as the way I've described it and says, yeah, under those conditions, it's really worthless. Someone who says, no, I see a value in it, but first of all, be very careful that the value that you see isn't something he'll do with it, something he'll get from it, some opportunity that will be realized with it, because that's all extrinsic.
Right.
I think it's going to be very difficult for you to even describe to yourself what it is you're seeing. Even if he's happier being free, then it's the happiness that's valuable, and the freedom gets him the happiness. Mm-hmm. It's got to be the freedom, just the freedom itself, with no other attendant caused consequences. I think it will be very, very difficult. Yes?
Even in the example you gave about the ice cream, you said the ice cream is intrinsically valued because it's pleasurable, because it gives him pleasure. And that the ice cream is only valuable insofar as the pleasure that it gives him. So it's not it's extrinsic.
Sorry, you're right. What I should have said was, I took this for granted, what I should have said was the pleasure of eating the ice cream.
Pleasure of eating the ice cream. So what is intrinsic? The pleasure of eating the ice cream is intrinsically valuable.
That's right.
Not the ice cream.
No, surely not. If the ice cream sits in the fridge, in the freezer, right, it's not valuable. It doesn't do anything for me. It's not having the ice cream, it's eating the ice cream. It's the pleasure of eating the ice cream that's I said it really. I said, why are you eating the ice cream? Because it's a pleasure. And why are you doing something that gives you a pleasure?
Because I like it.
Because I wanted the pleasure. Yeah. End of story. So what I want is the pleasure.
So it just seems to me that the closer you look at anything, like I said before, especially if you do things for Shem Shemaim, but even not, most things in life lose their intrinsic value very quickly.
So what? I mean, that doesn't change my argument, and it doesn't change the argument about.
It just makes it a bit less profound.
I don't. Well, I didn't. I didn't get to the point where I described what difference it makes, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic. But the difference has. And he said it well at the end of the table. He said it very well. The value of your freedom is determined by the value of the things you can do with it. Not only your freedom, but other people's freedom. So if there's a movement to overcome oppression, overcome tyranny, overcome violation of human rights and so forth and so on, they're not all equally valuable. The question is, if we increase people's freedom, what will they do with it? Not everyone's freedom is equally valuable. A person who uses freedom negatively, we already said, it can be valuable to knock him up. If a person is going to use his freedom to do things of no value whatsoever, he has no claim on my support for his freedom, because in my value system, his freedom isn't valuable, because he's not going to do anything valuable with it. And someone who's going to do something valuable with his freedom does have a claim, and the more valuable what he's going to do with it, the more claim he has on my support. I don't think people usually talk that way. People talk as if freedom were intrinsically valuable. Everybody's equal, and being coerced and restricted is a crime against humanity, and that being the case, should work for respect for human rights everywhere and for everyone indiscriminately. I think that's dead wrong. I don't think everybody's freedom is equally valuable in moral terms. Yeah.
So, to go to the example I gave before, indeed I would ask the question, if somebody is suicidal and is sick and I could cure him, is there any point, should I give him medicine?
Sure, of course, because he will get many, many things that he values if you do that. Why shouldn't you do it?
Like what?
I'm going to see how it's connected. After all, when you give someone something that's of extrinsic value, you're really helping him. When you give someone money, you're helping him. It's only extrinsically valuable. No, that's one of the differences that isn't true. It isn't true that you only make a person's life better if you give him something that has intrinsic value. Somebody's out of oxygen, like those poor guys, the Titanic, may be out of oxygen, and you provide them with oxygen, you've really benefited them by giving them something of extrinsic value. So the two aren't linked together. Being of intrinsic value and really helping somebody aren't linked together. You can really help somebody by giving something of extrinsic value.
So then giving freedom would be worth it.
Of course, the title was, why is freedom valuable? I wasn't attacking the value of freedom. I'm identifying why it's valuable. You have to take me literally now. You have to take me seriously.
Right.
I mean the words that I say. I said, why is it valuable? That implies that I think it is valuable. The question is, what kind of value it has? I started off by saying extrinsic values can be big and small. Intrinsic values can be big and small. Don't think that intrinsic means it's really valuable. And extrinsic means, no, it's just subjective, or it's just a joke, and it's not really valuable. I said, don't make that mistake. That's what I was guarding against, just this attitude that somehow extrinsic value isn't real value. It is real value. It's just a different kind of value. And the question is, what kind of value freedom has? Yeah.
Slightly off topic, would that mean life itself would be an extrinsic value as opposed to intrinsic?
I think it would be an extrinsic value. Yeah. Sure. It's just being alive. Certainly from our point of view, from the religious point of view. Again, I'm talking subjectively. I'm talking subjectively about how people value things. I'm not doing objective philosophy. It's much more questionable to do, whether human life has value just because it's human life. But for people, life is a matter of opportunities. And if you systematically destroy all those opportunities, vegetative state. Most people would say, if all I could look forward to, and I wouldn't be me looking forward, all that was possible for me was vegetative state until death, I have no value in that, because that life doesn't give me opportunities to do or experience anything that I want. Okay.